Welcome to the CSBP Fertilizers Grow Better podcast, sharing knowledge with growers on leading crop nutrition, sustainable agriculture and other issues impacting the agricultural industry.
G'day everyone, welcome to another episode of the CSBP Grow Better podcast. My name's Gray Johnston and I'm delighted to be joined today by Stephen Annells, Executive Manager of Fertilizer Australia, and Rob Norton from the University of Melbourne to talk about a recently published white paper on nitrogen fertiliser use and emissions. G'day Stephen, g'day Rob.
G'day Gray.
G'day Gray.
As is our tradition on the show, before we get into the meaty subject matter, we'll just love each of our guests to introduce themselves. So maybe Stephen, I'll ask you to go first. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your role and what you're up to?
Sure. I'm Stephen Annells, Executive Manager of Fertilizer Australia. My role is to run Fertilizer Australia and to ensure that the company is run appropriately. But the main thing is the purpose of Fertilizer Australia. We are the peak body for the Australian fertiliser industry, and our main role is to promote the sustainable and responsible use of fertiliser to protect the social licence for growers to use fertiliser into the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. And CSBP clearly is a member of Fertilizer Australia and has been a big supporter of the organisation for a number of years. And Rob, can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yes, thanks, Gray. Yeah, I've been a research and teaching academic with the University of Melbourne, and prior to that, Longrenon College, and various organisations that flowed from that, mainly in agronomy, soil and plant nutrition. Most recently, I was Regional Director for the International Plant Nutrition Institute based in Australia, and have been working in the area of soil and plant nutrition for about 45 years, mainly in the grains industry.
Brilliant. And look, wonderful to have you join us and our growers across WA, Australia and the world on the CSBP Grow Better podcast. Thank you, Rob. So we're talking today about the Fertilizer Australia nitrogen fertiliser use and greenhouse gases white paper. Stephen, can I tee you up? What's the white paper, and can you give us a bit of a guide as to the background behind it?
Yeah, sure, Gray. After the Albanese government was voted in May 2022, we looked at their emissions targets that were being put in place, and we also were aware of some of the other jurisdictions around the world and how they had handled the emissions from fertilisers. And we looked at places like Canada, where the government had attempted to put in place a 30% reduction in nitrogen emissions by cutting fertilisers by 30%. We looked at what was happening in New Zealand. We looked at what was happening in Europe. And we were concerned that the government might go looking for similar ways to cut emissions in Australia. So we decided we were going to put together a white paper, and we asked Rob and several other authors to join us, because we needed to be able to provide the government with a perspective on nitrogen emissions from fertiliser in the Australian context. It's a very, very different environment in Australia. It's dry. We don't have the emissions that other countries have from nitrogen fertilisers. And we wanted to make sure that the government was well aware of what they could expect from fertiliser when it comes to emissions reductions. They can achieve their aims without doing any damage to Australia's agriculture.
So fertiliser and the emissions relating to fertiliser, and particularly nitrogen fertiliser upstream and downstream, are topics that regular listeners to the CSBP Grow Better podcast will know that we have a lot of interest in at CSBP, and we've covered them in a variety of guises over the last couple of years that we've been doing this. And at CSBP we've run various events and information sessions for growers in WA, but maybe. Given that context, Rob, can you give us a Cliff Notes primer just to catch us all up on what the key emissions are relating to nitrogen fertiliser?
Yeah, I think the first step, Gray, is to say why nitrogen. Why is this focus suddenly on nitrogen, and why not on diesel fuels, etc., the other components? There is certainly a lot of importance attached to nitrogen just as a fertiliser. Every farmer knows the benefits of nitrogen. We live in a world of balances, though, and we use a lot of nitrogen fertilisers. Australia used 1.9 million tonnes of nitrogen in 2021, 2022. We grow a lot of food, but there are concerns of excess nitrogen getting into unintended places. And one of those unintended places is as nitrous oxide in the air from emissions due to nitrogen fertilisers, and also in soils, and also from what we call Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions associated with the production of fertilisers, particularly all nitrogen fertilisers, but also urea fertilisers. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, Gray, of course, the balance is we've got concerns over the fact that we need to keep using nitrogen to make sure that soil organic matter depletion isn't accelerated, and we end up with low food production and food insecurity. I mean, and farm profitability. All those things make it so important to get nitrogen in the right place.
Stephen, given that context from Rob, and I guess your big motivation in providing a view from the fertiliser industry to government, and I guess we've heard Rob talk about balance a couple of times there, and clearly providing a balanced view. What sort of terms of reference, or what were the key things you were looking to get out of the paper when you set Rob the task?
Yeah, sure. We wanted to have a scientifically based foundation to the paper. We wanted to be able to provide facts, provide the proof to those facts, to ensure that the government was aware of the fact that the research has been done, and we have a lot of information on emissions within Australia, to ensure that there is a very, very strong amount of proof in the paper. We didn't just want to put a paper to the government, which spurred out our views. We wanted to give a scientific basis to that. So I think it was a really, really important component of the paper that where the volumes of the emissions and where the emissions come from was spelled out. But Rob and the other authors put a fair bit of scientific proof into the paper as well.
So that leads nicely into my next question. I guess, Rob, can you tell us a little? I know everyone is itching to hear about answers and outcomes, but can you tell us a little bit about the process you went through and who you worked with to pull the paper together?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I certainly had the great benefit of working with my colleague in Victoria, Cameron Gooley, who's got a lot of expertise in animal industries and nitrous oxide and greenhouse gas implications. He's worked a lot in the dairy industry, and also Peter Grace from Queensland University of Technology, who has vast experience in measuring and monitoring and managing nitrous oxide in particular through a long series of federally and state and industry funded research projects looking at actually measuring nitrous oxide. And I think that's probably the most important aspect, is that a lot of the information that goes into the literature is really estimates based on what we call tier 1 estimates, which are what do you think? And I think Australia's now moved to what have you measured and what do you know, in what we call tier 2, 3 estimates of nitrous oxide. And we know vastly more about how to manage nitrous oxide now than we did, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And part of the work we did was to try and pull those threads about management together so we could understand and provide a framework for the industry to go forward with.
So let's jump into, I guess, what were those findings? What do you, what in your view were the key things to take away from the paper from the industry's perspective?
Well, I think the first thing is the scientific input has meant that we now have a better understanding of what we call the emission factor, which is how much nitrous oxide is generated from nitrogen fertiliser application, that's the use in the field. And the original estimates was 1.25% of nitrogen would end up as nitrous oxide. But the measurements have really honed in on and identified that figure to be about at least half that, maybe even less, particularly in the low rainfall cropping regions, which I've worked in, and a lot of the fertiliser is used, because about 2/3 of the nitrogen fertiliser is used in the grains industry. So I suppose the first thing to understand is that for a grower, the most important thing to understand is your nitrogen use efficiency. What's the nitrogen use efficiency of your paddock? And that can be done by measuring inputs and outputs, measurements of urea and MAP going in and UAN going in, and the removal in grain. And we found that at an average across Australia for wheat production systems, that's about 92, 93%. And in fact, depending which year you look at, it might be 100%. So virtually in many of our situations, we've got all the nitrogen being used that's being applied. But then if you go to some regions, and that's an overall region, if you look at the distribution, particularly in the low rainfall regions, we found with some survey data that we did in southeastern Australia, that about 2/3 of the properties, 2/3 of paddocks we surveyed over 4 or 5 years were in fact in nitrogen deficit. That is, their nitrogen balance was negative. They were removing more nitrogen than was being used. Now, that's a very efficient way to manage nitrogen, but unfortunately the consequence is that soil organic matter declines, and we all know that that's been the big issue for soil fertility. So the nitrous oxide that we think about, nitrous oxide emissions we think about for Europe are vastly different to what we have in Australia. Our focus on nitrous oxide is around about managing nitrogen to ensure you have the most efficient use of it at a paddock level. So making sure your inputs and outputs are balanced, or at least in a little surplus, and that will help growers manage their nitrogen program. But it also, I think the flow on to that is European agriculture and the European Union has been putting a lot of pressure on their farmers to reduce nitrogen input, nitrous oxide in particular. And the European farmers are saying back to the world, that's all very well, we can do that, but why should we have to compete and against high nitrous oxide producers? So farmers, I think, very soon will need to be considering their nitrous oxide and, in fact, their whole greenhouse gas footprint for their grain production systems, because that'll be another measure of accessibility to world trade, I think. So just understanding that from a nitrogen use efficiency to a nitrous oxide to a world trade side is quite a big step. So in our report, we tried to identify some of that, and we tried to identify some of the management strategies around improving nutrient performance, improving nitrogen use efficiency, and so therefore reducing nitrous oxide production.
I'm going to jump into those management strategies, but can I quickly take you back to the, because you've covered it in a couple of ways there, the discussion around emissions factors and the sort of global 1.25%, 1% of nitrogen converting to nitrous oxide versus what we now know are much lower factors in Australia and particularly even lower in dryland cropping systems. And we see some of that research from people like Louise Barton in here in Western Australia. Are those factors, like we talk about a lot at CSBP and in the discussions we have with various stakeholders here in WA, was that not well understood in Australia and by Australian governments and policyholders? Do you or Stephen have a view on that?
I don't deal very much with policyholders, but Stephen might make the comment that
policymakers, I should say.
Policymakers.
Yeah. Look, I don't believe it was very well understood by policymakers. Within the government, there was a view that there was quite a lot of emissions that came from fertilisers, and that it was an easy win for them to reduce emissions and reach their targets by targeting fertiliser. The work that Rob and his colleagues did has assisted us to be able to provide the government with a very, very clear picture of the amount of emissions that actually are coming from fertiliser. To add to Rob's point, I can remember at our recent conference, Fertilizer Australia conference in Adelaide, I asked Rob, being from Adelaide myself, what the emissions would be like on a paddock in where my family comes from up in the Mallee, and I think Rob indicated about 0.2%. So there just really isn't a lot of emissions that are actually coming from fertilisers in those dry land conditions. There are more in some of the wetter places that we do farming in Australia, but the government wasn't really aware of that. So the exercise now has really made them aware. And there's a great understanding from certainly from the Agriculture Minister, the Federal Agriculture Minister, and the Emissions Minister, the Climate Change Minister, Minister Bowen, with regard to the amount of emissions that do come from fertilisers. We presented a concept paper which preceded the white paper to Minister Watt, the Agriculture Minister, Minister Bowen's office, and also to the Prime Minister's office. And the Prime Minister himself spoke about nutrient use efficiency and some of the measures that we're looking at the Bush Forum in Tamworth in August last year. So the government has quickly got its head around the quantum of the emissions, and that a lot of that comes down to the good work that Rob and his colleagues did in creating such a clear picture and a clear scientifically based paper, and that information has been readily accepted by the government.
I think that understanding the fact that for all our emissions, the Australian-wide emissions, about 16% are from agriculture, and about nitrous oxide is about 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But that's in terms of agriculture. Agriculture produces 80% of the nitrous oxide, but fertilisers, dung and urine, crop residues and indirect emissions are the main contributors, and fertilisers is only one of the three contributors to agricultural greenhouse gas and total greenhouse gas. So it's 15% of 15%. So it's a significant component and something we can manage and need to manage. And I think that that's the message we would like to our policy makers to understand, that there are other things as well that need to be addressed. It's a complex problem and it has a complex solution.
So let's talk management action then. Rob, we talk a lot about it at CSBP, and we do our very best to work with growers and other participants in the industry to make sure that we're improving nutrient use efficiency through all the nutritional advice and research we do. Can you tell us a little bit about the views and recommendations you shared in the paper? Yeah,
I think from my time with IPNI over 10 years, we work strongly with this framework of 4R nutrient stewardship, was making sure within a framework of good agronomy, you use the right source at the right time, put in the right place, and use it at the right rate. And so that's where I say that it's a complex problem, because there's not one lever to pull. There's actually several aspects you need to consider. So, for example, we did a lot. We think that precision agriculture is a really significant component of managing nitrogen effectively and efficiently. And, paddock zoning, variable rate technologies, all those things have become are coming into place. There's probably more we can do in that area. Similarly, using on-the-go sensors for active nitrogen sensing. That's been something that's been developing over the past 10 years and 20 years, and that helps us put that nutrient in the right place. And also, I mean, but then that goes back to some fundamental things like soil testing. How do you get the rate right? Well, you need to soil test, and deep soil N is still the gold standard, at least for determining where your starting position is with nitrogen. And then when we come to source, we're actually the right source. We're bound with UAN and urea as the main nitrogen sources. And there are some strategies and technologies around enhanced efficiency fertilisers, nitrogen stabilisers in particular, that help us contain the nitrogen in ammonia forms rather than in nitrate forms, which leach and which can then rapidly convert, which then partly convert to nitrous oxide. So I think there are technologies such as DMPP, which has been around for a long time. Again, it has some issues as a fertiliser amendment, and there are new technologies coming along behind that, developed here in Australia and also internationally, looking at alternatives to DMPP in terms of nitrification inhibitors. And in terms of the work that Peter Grace did, his work through the NANOR program, nitrous oxide research project, said that nitrous oxide emissions could be reduced for 80%, by 80% in non-irrigated cropping. So there's an immediate win for the environment and for growers. The trouble at the moment is that things like DMPP is still quite high, and I think one of the recommendations we made was to think about incentivising DMPP use, the government incentivising DMPP use by growers to encourage its use, its uptake and adoption at a wider scale.
Look, and we've CSBP was really proud to bring what we call Urea Sustain to the WA market last year, which is a coated product, a combination of MBPT and DMPP. We saw brilliant uptake on the back of some really positive field trial results in 2022 and again, a nice set of trial results in 2023 in a different seasonal condition, still supporting the benefits around both nitrification, denitrification you're referring to, and volatilisation in WA conditions, seeing some really nice efficiency improvements, and we expect to see continuing uptake of those kind of products here in the WA market. And you referred there to potential government involvement in supporting those. Is there any progress on that, Stephen?
Look, we have been speaking with the government with regard to a scheme which attempts to reduce the cost of the treatment. We're still in discussions with the government on that. The government, I think, is still in the process of working out which way it's going to go forward with the emissions from agriculture, fertiliser just being one of those components. They are certainly interested in the concept that we put forward, which would reduce the cost of those additional inputs to the nitrogen, and we are hopeful that they will pick that up. We've also been speaking with them about some of the practice change component, which Rob alluded to with the 4Rs. We have a strong belief in the 4Rs and the FertCare system to be able to ensure the farmers are efficiently using fertiliser. They're using, as Rob said, the right fertilisers, the right rates at the right times in the right places. And those things assist to reduce the amount of emissions that are released. Probably not so related to the West over there, but in Queensland, the Great Barrier Reef, there is interest in these products as well, because slowing that pathway of a urea to nitrate also has some implications for water quality as well. So we are working with other governments, such as the Queensland government, on some of these initiatives as well. We are keen to see both practice change and technology change being looked at by the government, and all discussions with them so far have been quite positive. They are really impressed with the fertiliser industry and its proactivity in this space, and that's won us quite a few brownie points.
I mean, we know that the Australian farm subsidy regime is nothing like the US, and one of the gripes I often hear from industry participants in Australia is US growers are incentivised to go to things like no-till when practices like that have been widely adopted already in Australia. We are already doing a pretty good job, I think.
No, that's absolutely, and our growers should be congratulated, and they are. They don't need congratulations. They know how well they're doing. Their soils are healthy. I think there's another dimension to reducing greenhouse gas impacts of due to fertilisers, and that's in the production system itself, and probably this is what we call Scope 3, which are upstream production issues relating to fertiliser production. And there's probably, it depends where the urea is derived from, but there might be another, at least as much, if not more, carbon footprint due to fertiliser manufacture than to fertiliser use. And there's a lot of interest globally in what we call green ammonia, which ammonia is the feedstock into urea production and nitrogen fertiliser production. And the feedstock usually is methane, which is a fossil fuel. If we can use other sources to produce the hydrogen that goes onto the urea, onto the ammonia, say from water hydrolysis, using electrolysis, for example, there's a great potential there to reduce the carbon footprint of nitrogen fertilisers, and that's a very interesting area. And there's some excellent presentations at the Fertilizer Australia conference in Adelaide about some of the technologies. It's a pretty exciting area and has great environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, you call it Scope 3, Rob, but we call it Scope 1 at CSBP. I mean, we've got an ammonia plant, and we're absolutely because of that, producing Flexia and UAN today, but equally very, very focused on and listeners to this podcast have heard us talk to a number of those technology people you're talking about some of the opportunities, and in WA we're also investigating some low emissions conventional ammonia opportunities. Carbon capture and storage, which could be a really good opportunity here given the gas resource we have in WA.
No, I think the terms grey ammonia and blue ammonia is where you have carbon capture and storage, and green ammonia is where you use renewables. So those terms will come into common usage as opposed to grey ammonia, which, if it was my hair, is probably grey hair. It gives us all grey hair. But grey ammonia is a traditionally produced one using fossil fuel feedstocks.
But given that we are using fossil fuel feedstocks at the moment, I guess those efficiency improvements on farm you talked about almost give a double whammy. If you can use less and reduce the emissions at the same time, it's sort of a double benefit, right?
Absolutely, and it's an issue about making sure that you have that 4R, right source, rate, time, place combination, and understand what levers to pull to make sure that you optimise your nitrogen management strategies. And again, if you want one, just soil test, for goodness sake.
That, I mean, nothing could speak more closely to what we talk about a lot at CSBP and some of the messages we're always keen to share with our team and with the growers and the topics we talk about here on the podcast. So I think that's a great place to end the discussion today. It's been a real pleasure chatting to both of you, Rob and Stephen, and great to hear about the work that's been done and the benefit it's having for the industry in terms of making sure that the key people who need to understand the result of nitrogen fertiliser use and its impact on emissions do have a really good and balanced picture of that. So, look, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Stephen, for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Rob.
Yep.
And thank you all out there in podcast world. This has, of course, been another episode of the CSBP Grow Better podcast. As always, you should jump on our socials at CSBP Fertilisers on your favourite channels. Subscribe, rate and review the podcast. And keep in touch with your local account manager if you require any fertiliser for this coming season. But until next time, I've been Gray Johnston. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Rob. See you all later. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into another episode of the CSBP Grow Better podcast. For more information about CSBP, please visit csbp-fertilisers.com.au or connect with us on social media at CSBP Fertilisers on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn.